Hello, everyone. This is Grant Shirk. I'm the head of marketing here at Vera, and I'd love to welcome you to our next webinar, 5 questions about managing security risk under the GDPR. This is, I think, a very interesting topic, and we'll get into it. And certainly this has been the webinar where we've seen the highest amount of participation and registration. So I'm really looking forward to the conversation today. I expect the discussion will take between 30 and 45 minutes. We usually do not go the full hour. We like to give everybody a little bit of time back in your day. And we are recording the session today if you'd like to come back and review it or share it with the rest of your team. Before we get started here, and as I see the last few people joining in, I do have some quick housekeeping. If you have not joined a Zoom webinar before, all of your controls are going to be at the bottom of your screen. There's generally a black bar down there with buttons for Q&A, comments, and other tools that you can use to manage audio and video and everything else. Definitely want to be adding your questions to this list of the 5. So if you have specific questions about any of the content we cover or anything we did not cover today, please add it into the Q&A session, and my team will flag it and we'll get that collected and answered for you. Also, if you do have any issues with the tech, audiovisual, you can use the commenting section as well, and we'll be able to jump in and help you with that as quickly as we can. All right, with that out of the way, let's get started. As I mentioned at the very, very start of the call, GDPR is definitely subject to a little bit of the buzzword bingo these days. I was doing a little bit of preparation this morning, and good old-fashioned non-scientific research. I identified that over 3.5 million guides, blog posts, articles, and other both professional and unprofessional analyses of what is the GDPR and what does it mean have been posted since January 2017. And I get the sense that this is a little bit of an exponential curve. I would not be surprised to see that number more than double over the next 5 months on our path to May. However, a lot of them are really focused on the specifics of the articles, the sizes of the fines, why this is a kind of a mind share shift in the eyes of both international law, security, and privacy. But one of the things that we've seen consistently over and over and over again, and we're hearing from our customers, is that there are 4 or 5 kind of fundamental questions, foundational questions that organizations, whether they're in manufacturing and engineering, if they're in technology, finance, or even media and entertainment, really have about how to contextualize this information for their leadership team. How do they make intelligent decisions about where to invest and why? And ultimately, how to present a very complex topic, both upward and outward across the organization. Because I think, as all of us know at this point who've been focused on this for a while, a huge component of this is going to be awareness, interpretation, and management over the long term. And I think those are a lot of the questions we're going to tackle today. So what I asked our team to do here with our customer success team, our security and compliance team, as well as what we're hearing in conversations with prospects is, what are those 5 key questions? And my goal for the next 30 minutes or so is to walk through those and provide some of the context and insight we've been able to capture from those conversations. Ultimately, if we're successful, that will mean that we'll have some clear answers and frameworks for each of these that hopefully will help you and your team's guide kind of getting over the finish line over the next 5 months. But then also, how do we make GDPR a workable, practical reality and really a new way of thinking and operating into the future? Because unlike Y2K, this is not a one-time thing. This is going to have impact for years. And we'll actually touch on that in the first question. So I think still a lot of people, particularly here in the US, have questions on, wait, where did this come from? Where did the GDPR stem from? Why is this such a big issue? Next set of questions are really around, can I simplify my approach? How do I make sense of these 99 articles? And then digging into it, which of those are most important around security, right? We'll break this up into some categories and really talk about data protection and control. The next is it's always about ROI. And I think there have been actually just this week some very interesting comments from the UK ICO, their information protection organization, and controllers around how to interpret this language, which I think is kind of late breaking news, but very interesting. And we'll talk about that as well. And then of course, broadly, as we look beyond May 28th, is there a more efficient approach to tackling these security and privacy challenges? So these are the topics we're going to cover today. If this is of use, would love to have you here for the rest of the time. If not, let us know what questions that you have, and we'll try to include those as we go. All right, let's get started. So the existential questions of our time. How did we get here, and where are we going, right? Whether you're talking about religion, technology, security, and privacy, these are foundational questions that we're all trying to struggle with. But I think it is a very good place to start in the discussion about the GDPR. Getting to the facts of the matter, the GDPR is an extension, an improvement, a replacement for a 20-year-old regulation called the DPD, or the Data Protection Directive. This is a set of laws that were instituted as part of the European Union and the EU Commission. In 1995 is when they were originally written, and they were designed to codify and ultimately enforce one of the core, I think of the Bill of Rights in the United States. In the EU, there are some core fundamental rights that are established there as well. One of them is actually built around personal privacy. And you'll see that a lot of this is really about that balance between privacy and control of personal data or individual data. Now, this law has been on the books and been enforced since, so written in 95, enforced since 96, but a lot has happened since then. And if you think about it, when these laws around personal privacy and personal data were enacted, there's been a lot of changes. I mean, back in 1996, I got my first taste of the Mosaic browser, right? So this whole internet thing, World Wide Web, moving from a corporate and a defense domain, a research domain, into truly the public domain, hadn't really occurred yet, right? We were still in that issue where data was generally siloed and contained within organizations as opposed to exposed, shared, and collaborated on. Certainly the mobile revolution had not taken off yet. We were still in the early days of Nokia at that point, where the SIM card may have had personal data on it, but it was a simple set of name value pairs, name and a phone number. Beyond that, certainly, and we all know that that a lot of the focus of the GDPR is around marketing data, social media data, purchase data. And so this whole social thing is certainly a last few years component of this that didn't exist 20 years ago. And then finally, the prevalence and processing of mass amounts of large data sets, both within organizations and across organizations in the cloud, is driving a ton of the momentum around why the GDPR needed to be put into place. And really, if you simplify it and boil it down, what it's trying to do is address three crucial gaps in the original Data Protection Directive from 1996, which was one, unify and simplify laws across the EU. The way the DPD was originally written, all of the 27 member states in the EU had the ability to kind of write their own rules about data protection, which is why you saw so many differences in how the UK versus Germany versus Switzerland versus Poland managed personal data, which creates a lot of complexity and stifled really some innovation and investment in the EU. The second was these last four things we talked about, really handling the modern technology that was changing the way information was transmitted and used, both personally and in the corporate world. And then finally, to give law enforcement some better tools to monitor, define, and enforce a lot of these provisions. So that's how we got to where we are today. We were all given basically a 2-year grace period to get ready for the GDPR. And I think a lot of the excitement and noise and interest is being driven, particularly here in North America, about this May 28th deadline that's coming up. And I think a lot of the ballyhoo and the noise has been put around the potential fines. And certainly this is one of those regulations that has a lot of teeth, and I think that's what's driving a lot of the concern, both domestically and abroad, is that if you mess up, the risk is high. There are really two categories of fines. Everybody likes to talk about the right-hand side, that 20 million or 4% of annual turnover or revenue, which, yeah, I mean, for an average Fortune 500 company, that could create fines approaching and in excess of $1 billion per violation, which is not insignificant. And a lot of that is around some of these key ideas of improper use of data, the collection of personal data without consent, or improper transfer of information. What has been spoken about a lot less, because it's the smaller number, I think, and we're just human beings at nature, is that there's another set of fines that are just as onerous. It's half, but still half of a billion is a lot. Half of 20 million is a lot. Is that it's around mismanagement of data or the failure to protect it adequately. And we'll talk a little bit more about this, but there are some really critical things that organizations need to put into place around the protection, the management, and the control over how data can be accessed and used in an organization. And so this is definitely a driver for investment in the area, and I think it's also it's created a lot of noise in the market, and so hopefully we can cut through some of that in these next few questions. So that was the first. How did we get here? Why is it significant? Why do people keep talking about it? And why does every vendor in the world wants to tell me about their GDPR solution? I think as we get through this, it will be clear that there is no one solution to this. And what's most important for all of us is to think about the implications and how we are going to approach GDPR for our organization, because a lot of those things can be different from company to company and depending on the kinds of data that you. So let's talk about the second question then. Can I, in this world where there's a lot of noise, there's a lot of challenge, can I simplify my approach to how I address this within my organization? And I think both intentionally and unintentionally, the way the GDPR was written, it's fueling this frustration or this confusion about how to approach it. And so, as we just discussed, stemming from the DPD, what the GDPR is trying to do is ensure individual privacy as a fundamental right, taking into account the way our world is operating today. However, unlike many other past regulations, whether you're looking at FINRA regulations in the SEC domestically, if you're looking at specific country regulations under the DPD, it doesn't actually prescribe any specific solutions. So what you wind up with is a very complex set of regulation that is not prescriptive. And it's designed that way because they saw how poorly the DPD aged. And so they're trying to put some consistency in place. But what it creates for us is a lot of room for interpretation. And again, a lot of room for, think pieces and thought pieces about it. What we've tried to do, and as we've talked to our customers, a lot of those articles can be boiled down into a few core areas of focus. And that's how we would recommend kind of building a framework around this to guide your own investment and guide your own planning around the GDPR. Even if it's a checklist for, am I doing X, Y, and Z? We found this has been a very useful rubric for our customers. And so when you tackle the GDPR and you're trying to address it for the first time, or if you're trying to see if you are complete in your analysis and assessment, it's useful to think about kind of 6 key categories here, 6 key components. The important thing to remember is that this is all centered around this idea of individual privacy as a fundamental right. And you do have to think about privacy and security as separate things. Security is definitely focused on the confidentiality, the integrity, and the availability of data. Nothing has changed there. In the world of privacy, though, I actually really like the way the EU and I think the European state of mind is on this, which is that my privacy is really defined by my ability to control how my information is used. It's that control component that is really critical, and you'll see that actually played out across these. So then if you break down the articles of the GDPR into these ideas, keeping individual privacy at the center, you find that there's a few major themes that run through it. First, there's definitely the expanded global scope. And I think there's a lot has been said here. I won't spend a lot of time, but if you do business with EU citizens and you are touching what's considered personal information or protected personal information, you are subject to the GDPR. It doesn't matter if you have 0 employees, 0 offices in the European Union. If you're dealing with citizens, you are subject to these regulations. So this makes it really the first truly global privacy regulation. And so there's a lot of definitions there. The second category is around the ability for an individual to have visibility and control over their own information. And this is that core tenet of privacy in this definition that says that as a citizen, as an individual person, I have the ability to see and understand how my information is being used, to dictate the terms around how it is used. And that's everything from consent law to this idea of the right to be forgotten. Kind of think of the full life cycle of data in this this legislation, and to be able to personally direct some of that. There are definitely limitations and restrictions around that are more favorable to business, but that's the core idea. The third one is around data protection by default and by design. The idea there is that security and protection of information needs to be built directly into systems, not something that is added on or bolted on after the fact or done as an afterthought. And I think that's critical. You often hear people talk about privacy by default and privacy by design. What that's asking organizations to do is take a more thoughtful, proactive approach to how information is going to be managed. And the intent of that is to not only provide more personal visibility and control, but more assurances throughout data's lifecycle that it is being treated appropriately based on the needs of the business. The fourth category here is notification of exposure. This is that 72-hour breach notification rule. And I think that's something that the recent challenges around data breaches at Uber and some other companies who are just now announcing breaches that happened 6 months, 12 months, 18 months ago. That's going to have to change very, very quickly because the penalty of not diagnosing and not notifying on data are significant. However, there are also some nice provisions in there around what needs to be notified on. And so I think it's worth digging into those articles and understanding what does it mean to a breach notification if I can demonstrate how I've protected that data and who had access to it in the first place. And that comes back to the security components of this framework. And then finally, of course, there's the compensation and liability, which gets back to the fines that we just talked about. This entire framework, all of these 5 key principles are wrapped within a framework of corporate governance and responsibility and accountability. And these are the areas around appointing a data protection officer, the specific liabilities and responsibilities of directors of companies who are subject. And I think there's also a lot of work that needs to be done there just to make sure that that governance and that accountability is aligned with these five areas. I just noticed here that there a chat came in that's actually on this topic. So I'm going to pause for a second and address that. So the question is, if you have EU personnel working in America, does the law still apply to that or those persons' data? Or rather, does the organization need to focus only on the local privacy laws? Okay, that's a good question. And so my first answer to this is I would definitely check with privacy counsel if you can. I think that the team at Field Fisher, who's a group that we've worked with pretty extensively here, has some commentary on this, but I definitely reach out to Field Fisher or take out their privacy law blog that you have online. I'll share that out to the group as a follow-up. But these laws definitely apply to both customer data as well as personnel data. So if they are EU citizens, they are protected by EU law. So my first guess is yes, absolutely. To which extent, I would turn to your counsel or your privacy consultant on that. But yeah, this is EU citizen, customer, or employee. You have to think about how we manage their personal data. And there are 2 or 3 categories of personal data that are defined. And there's one special category with information like gender, disability, sexual orientation, and other things that carry additional weight under the GDPR. So good question, thank you. All right, third question. We've defined a framework. We've got these kind of 5 key fundamental concepts, as well as the governance and accountability that model them. But what of them really matter to the questions of data security, protection, and control? Because if you remember, that was a key wedge of the 5. And I think this is an area where a lot of organizations really struggle, because a lot of their work up front has been on how do I get my accountability, my ownership, and my governance framework in place to be able to state on day one, okay, yes, we are largely GDPR compliant. The challenge with the way the GDPR is built is that a lot of these articles that cover strong data protections, the ability to change how data can be accessed and used over time, and then dealing with breaches now into the future, actually have some very long-term consequences for how we think about implementing GDPR over time. And so there are 1, 2, 4, 6, 9 articles that I would really ask you to take a more detailed look at when you get back after this conversation, because they have some very interesting impacts around how you think about securing and controlling access to information. So there are 4 articles that specifically speak to strong data protections. It's Article 5, 9, and then 25 and 32. These have been discussed pretty broadly, but the first one states that personal data must be protected, and that is both obfuscated as well as controlled how it can be used and used for specific purposes. That means that we need policies enforced at the data level that say how and where information can be used. And a lot of that comes with how that information was consented in the first place. Article 9, we mentioned this. These define those special categories of personal data that require extra protection and control. So there is an element here of having different policy for different kinds of information. And then later in Article 25 and 32, this is where the GDPR defines those concepts of data protection by design and by default, and also into ongoing and persistent protections and tracking. So not only do you have to be able to demonstrate that the moment we acquire data, that we are protecting its both confidentiality and privacy controls by default, but that the design of those systems ensures that we can track, report on, and demonstrate into the future that we are still using that information according to business need, consent, and within the scope of the law. So there are long-term implications to how we protect this data. And that can be challenging because data moves between different systems and different owners. We've got to be able to keep that up to date. And that's what takes you to this next set of regulations around control. And so there's definitely privacy and protection, but then there's control. So a very easy example of this is Article 17, which is the right to be forgotten. And this ties back to that personal visibility and control over data. I have the right as an EU citizen to request either copies of my data and information on how it's being used, or to say, please remove my personal data, my personal information from your system. And so not only does that mean that I have to be able to do that and produce that data, but the implication is that I have to be able to track and understand where that information is and how is it being used at any point in time. And then Article 28 extends that responsibility and says that these requirements for control and protection extend beyond my immediate organization and into my quote-unquote supply chain. The sub-processors and other organizations that may be using that data also I have to assert that I have validated that they have adequate security and controls to manage personal data. And so that means that we now have a burden to protect and maintain essentially the stewards of that data, even after it's moved out to a third-party site for viable business purposes. And that can be challenging if we're only looking at the level of systems or initial egress of data. We have to be able to track it. And then, of course, finally, there's this breach impact. The point that I want to make here on these around that 72-hour breach is really that second line in the second component of Article 33 and 34 is that if we can demonstrate that data has remained encrypted at transit and at rest, and that the system, the individual or the activity that generated the breach in the first place did not have access to specific subsets of that data, we do not have to issue a breach notification for that. So apply this thinking to a famous breach in the past, the Office of Personnel Management here in the United States. This was the one where a hacker was able to extract about 25 million personnel records from an internal database. They had access to the system. They got access to the system. Those credentials then gave them access to all of the data on that system because it was assumed that if I had access to the system, I had privileges to the data. We know that that's not really the case or the way to solve that problem. If those records had been individually encrypted and access to individual files had been gated at a more granular level, the upshot of that is the impact of that breach to everyday people would have been dramatically minimized. The risk management side of that argument is that the scope of the breach notification that would have had to have been issued would be dramatically reduced. You would only have to disclose to those people whose specific information had been accessed. And so I think there's some interesting implications of this as well. And I think that takes us to our fourth question, which is, okay, great, I could go do all the things, which is driving, I think, the massive amount of spending that Gartner and other analyst firms are talking about. I've seen everyone from PwC to Gartner. There was a recent law firm study that went out that said that most large organizations will spend between $500,000 and $1 million in just the initial prep for GDPR. And that expense is expected to grow year over year at a pretty linear rate. And so the big question that we all face, because we all understand that risk is always a balancing act, is where am I going to get the biggest ROI from this? This was that late breaking news that I actually just found yesterday. And there's an article on Wired in the UK where they actually did an updated primer on GDPR. But I found this really interesting set of quotes and context from Elizabeth Denham, who's the UK Information Commissioner. There's a lot been made out of the large fines or the potential for large fines. But she made two comments. One of here was quoted and the other was paraphrased. One is that it's scaremongering to suggest that we're going to be making early examples of organizations that breach the law. I've certainly heard that, if you're Facebook, Google, a large marketing organization or a large retail organization, look out, right? You're going to be in trouble. I think the way that she characterized this is that, at least in the United Kingdom, that the ICO office has indicated that their intent with this is to improve privacy and privacy practices overall, so that organizations who have demonstrated a clear awareness of the impact and intent of the GDPR and are making good faith efforts to implement it are definitely going to get the benefit of the doubt in this conversation. So the good thing is everybody acknowledges that this is a big, hairy problem that we need to work through, but that working through it makes everybody incrementally better over time, which is the goal. And so in that context, what we've seen companies doing is really breaking down their investment into those 5 categories we talked about earlier in the rainbow, into where they're putting their dollars and where they expect to see the most long-term impact. So the first one here is definitely, and it is kind of a fundamental or a foundational component, is you've got to get your DPO and governance structure in place. Fortunately, these are relatively easy to do, and they're things that could be done on paper and with the participation of the organization. But having your governance framework in place and your accountability in place will make a lot of the rest of what you have to do incredibly valuable. But the core of where companies need to focus is in these middle 2 areas. One is around strong data protections by privacy and by default and by design, but then the control over that data to allow organizations to monitor, manage, and control access to information according to business purposes and changing business conditions over time. And if you can prioritize your investment in those areas, not only are you going to be able to more effectively demonstrate that you understand the intent and the impact of the code, you are taking thoughtful action in the direction of compliance, and that you are thinking long-term about how this is going to impact your business, you're going to be much better off in your implementation. And then certainly there are things that you need to do that are very specific to processes and people. Specifically, how are we updating and managing our breach notification process? Where do we see our risks? Where do we need to shore those up? And then the basic training and awareness, not just for security and privacy teams, but for anyone in the organization who has the potential to touch data. And this is everyone from HR to marketing to customer success and field people who do touch personal data. Make them understand what their responsibilities are and what restrictions you're going to be enforcing around that information. We know that every company is different and you have different resources to put into play, but some variation on this framework has worked for our customers, whether they have 100 employees or if they have 100,000 employees. You know, they're going to weight things differently, have strengths in different areas. But if you can build a framework along this, it's definitely going to simplify and improve your chances of getting a strong return from what you're doing in the GDPR. All right, we're rounding the bend here. I think we're on track and on time. And so the last question is okay, great. We've talked about where this is coming from, why it's so significant, how different companies are categorizing and building a framework around the GDPR for their organization. And I think the next question is well, there's clearly a brute force way to address this, and I'm not sure we have time left to do that, but is there a more efficient approach to tackle some of these challenges, particularly the stickier ones around data protection and flexible data control? And I think the simple answer is yes, there is a more efficient way, but I think the real answer is a lot closer to yes, but it's going to require us to change the way we think about protecting information, whether you're looking at it from the privacy filter or if you're looking at it from the point of view of your security team. Today, a lot of our practices and training and tools are built on a more reactive model. They're focused on how do I respond to a new threat? How do I reactively or retroactively plug a hole in the dam? They're really focused on restriction of access to information. And that's a very interesting component. If you read through the early articles of the GDPR, there are actually a lot of provisions around making it easier for companies to do business, streamlining the way they manage data. And so we need to move away from thinking that if I just lock more and more and more stuff down, it's going to be easier. that actually almost flies into the face of some of the intent around the GDPR. A lot of our tools are segregated, and they're focused on specific applications, specific repositories of data, and specific workflows. And in a world where we have to be able to track data and how it's being used across services, that doesn't work very well anymore. We need something that's a little more of a fabric that runs through the organization. And we're still very perimeter and possession focused. And I think that's actually the biggest shift, is that we need to move our organizations from a world where we're focused on controlling who has possession of data to one where we're much more focused on how do I control who and what systems have access to data, and what are their policies and permissions around it. Because if we can make that shift, it allows us to be a lot more proactive, flexible, and kind of data-centric in our operations, which is going to pay a lot of long-term dividends for our companies. And so to do that, we tend to recommend to our customers that they really start thinking about this entire problem from the data first and work their way out. We think about it as data-centric security or data-centric control. And the idea is if that you can focus first on the basics and really focus on encrypting and obfuscating the data that you are collecting and using and sharing across your organization. That is a huge first step, but it's definitely not enough because it doesn't meet those longer term requirements. The second is to think about access and think about control of data over the long term, and work on tools and approaches that can enforce access to information much more dynamically at any point in time. This allows you to say that, yes, we have consent from this set of users to use their data for marketing purposes for a specific period of time. That means that, my marketing team should have access to it, but maybe my legal team or my finance team or my product team should not have access to that data. And I need to be able to not only enforce that now, but in 18 months when my consent expires, I need to be able to lock that data down even for marketing. And then we have to be able to change and adapt how we can use data according with business needs and personal data regulation over time, and be able to ensure that no matter where that data has moved to, what repository I'm keeping it in, I can enforce that a consistent set of usage rights around that data. The fortunate thing about this is if I do take this approach, not only am I going to improve my ability to comply with things like GDPR, but I'm also improving my defense in depth around normal data in the organization. And what we found is that organizations that take this approach, using products that can provide these 3 layers of protection, not only do they dramatically improve their ability to protect and control information, they're doing it in a way that enables the business users to continue to work on their own terms. They're not forcing new processes. They're not forcing new tools or new ways of doing work. And overall, that's going to improve your awareness and compliance at the employee level, right? There's that people and process stuff we talked about in the framework. And if you can do that, it opens up a ton of opportunities. So yes, not only are you securing more data by default as you're collecting and creating it, you can be much more agile in your business processes because you're enforcing how that data can be used no matter where it's traveled to. You're getting a lot better tracking and auditability. So when someone does come in, a regulator stops by and asks how you're protecting information, where you're protecting it, and what kind of monitoring and management can you show me to demonstrate your compliance, you're going to get a lot better granular data over how information is being used across the organization. And then ultimately, it's that dynamic ability to change access to information over time. That's going to enable that long-term compliance with this regulation into the future. And I think those are all really, really critical. All right, as promised, we were targeting less than an hour, and I think we're right there for this. Before I get to any last questions, I do have one last resource I want to offer to you. We're going to make the recording of this and the slides available to all of you afterwards, but there's also a really great ebook on not just some of these topics around the GDPR, but also the long-term implications of this to information privacy and security that the folks at AIM have put together. Now, if you're unfamiliar with AIM, they're kind of it's literally the Association of Information Managers. So these are the knowledge managers and the records management teams who are trying to apply a lot of these policies to all of the wealth of unstructured information and data flowing through organizations. And they've worked with a lot of different companies in this area to really net out some of the implications beyond just getting ready for May 28th. You can get a free copy at the link below, and we'll also share that out, but it's a very valuable resource for your teams. All right, so to close out here, I really appreciate your time today. I'm going to dive in and see if we have any additional questions to add to our 5, but definitely looking forward to continuing this conversation with all of you. So if you do have a question, you can raise your hand or jump into the Q&A session and drop those in there. But let's see what we've got here. All right, first one. You mentioned about cross-border transfer of the data. For global companies, that's right, you don't necessarily have the choice of storing the data in specific data centers. Cloud is definitely taking more prominence. So the big question is, given this complexity, right? We've got data everywhere. We don't necessarily have the resources to put things in very specific locations, and the cloud. Do you have to store data in the Eurozone only, or is having the sufficient security and access control is good enough? It's a little bit of both. So from the interpretations that I have seen and the guidance that we're giving our customers, the GDPR does not require you to store data in the EU or in the Eurozone. However, this gets into a lot of the model clauses in your contracts with your customers that I would highly recommend your legal team review and have a strong point of view on. And so it's a combination of what are the clauses that you use to manage the privacy and access to data in your agreements with your customers and how it can be managed. 2 is what are the both physical and virtual controls you've put around that data, and definitely data-centric controls around encryption, access control, and dynamic policy management go a very long way to helping you enforce your own written policies around data. And then even beyond that, a lot of cloud services today are actually providing premium services that do give you a little more granular control over how and where your data is stored. I don't have a more specific answer for you than that, because there is some room for interpretation on this, but that's ultimately going to be up to your legal team on how you need to manage that data based on consent, business need, and capability. Let's see, I did see we had a hand raised. Unfortunately, if we can help you, if you can put your question into either the Q&A panel or chat, would love to get that answered for you. So we'll try to jump that in here. Also, just for those of you who are looking for chat, my colleague Smita has posted the link for the AIM ebook in that, so you can click directly from there. Okay, great. So I think that's all we are getting today. I really appreciate your time. And if there are other questions that we can handle for you, or if there are specific topics you want to address in more depth, we'd love to engage with you either on social at Vera Security, or you can just send me a note directly, grant@vera.com, and I can bring our security and privacy team to bear to get that handled for you. So thank you all very much. Have a great rest of your day, and good luck getting to May 28th. Thanks, everyone.